And welcome everybody. We live, episode number 7, 2021. Get it. And I'm privileged today to have somebody very, very special on the podcast. I met Richard about, I don't know, 15 years ago
Easily.
as a youngster working on a service desk.
A lost soul.
Um, yeah, and I caught a liking, and then we had some shared interest. Yeah. Um, yeah, and today, I suppose I would call him my number one confidant when it gets to testing new ideas, and also a very very good friend. So welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Johan. Yep, we've come a long way. You've definitely played a very important role in my success today. That's for sure.
Thank you for that, Richard.
All the philosophical discussions paid off. Eh? They weren't just a load of nonsense. It would seem.
Man, yeah. So, Richard, you've so congratulations, you've just been promoted,
That's right.
principal
Yes,
cloud
that's right. Yeah,
strategist and customer advisor
that's
at
right.
Microsoft. And I suppose it's because of that we're talking about the subject today. This issue of everybody that, as they want to go cloud, want to forget about the past and everything that was good in the past. And I'm not saying everything in the past was good, um, but I suppose the next shiny thing should be treated with a little bit of or a little bit reserved, instead of just saying that we're going to chuck all of the old out. So, what is your experience when you have conversations with customers about our traditional way of doing best practice? The service management that you and I grew up on. Um,
It's 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 complicated, I guess. Is the long and the short of it. I mean, that's the easy answer, right? It's complicated, and I'll throw the consulting answer and say, well, it depends. Um, I think we could look at it like this: How old is lean? How old are all the principles of manufacturing that have now made their way into DevOps, into all the IT, all the cloud stuff that we're doing today?
70
50,
years.
70, easily 70 years.
70 years, 1951.
I mean, I don't think those principles, I mean, the practices have shifted and changed and developed over time, but the principles themselves, they've been pretty concrete and they're just as relevant, more so today than, no, not more so, but I mean, DevOps for me is absolutely constructed, and it's known. I mean, that the authors acknowledge that it comes from the lean, the manufacturing concepts. All of these new flashy things are associated to principles that have been around since when I picked up a textbook and tried to start learning about it when I was much younger than the younger self that I am today.
Yeah.
The challenge is keeping up with all of it. I mean, I think even ITIL, the principles still are very strong in all of the elements. I think the challenge we have is the contention that's been caused between, the DevOps and the ITIL groups. I mean, I see it a lot in practice. This whole notion of DevOps being integrated. It's absolutely happening in many places, but I'm seeing a bigger divide happening between practitioners. The one thing it's supposed to be addressing, it's actually pushing further apart. So yeah, when we're talking a framework and so forth, I guess I'm also trying to have a discussion about, well, what are we trying to achieve, and focusing more on the outcomes, less on the framework. I think that's been a good burning of the fingers that I've had, and you've been around to, my early days, going out with my pistol gun and saying, hey, I'm going to transform this company, and it being just framework orientated because that's all I knew, and landing on my backside and having to account for the fact that we made no progress because I was trying to figure out how we were going to do it. I'm building us a framework to do this great stuff, and nothing was. We didn't meet the objectives we had because of solving the wrong problems.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think very light. It touches it very lightly, but it's. I guess what I try and do now with people is I'm meeting a lot of people who are still using ITIL version 3. Understandably so. ITIL version 4 is extremely new. And how much of it's changed? There is significant positive change, but the principles are still the same. A lot of the process is still the same. And the question is, how do we do this with cloud? And yeah, that's, I guess, the starting point of the discussion, I suppose.
So it's safe to say that there are certain things that remains unchanged. Those things are principles. There are certain things that constantly change. They tend to be, let's call it, the things that's affected and influenced by technology. And I don't want to call it technology because I think it's the change is more fundamental. It's more social, most probably, than just behavioral than technology as such. And it's this repeated cycle that we've actually seen for the last, I've been in IT for nearly 40 years, and we keep on seeing the same thing happening. Bright, shiny thing, everything about the tool, forget about good behavior, forget about good practices, forget about what the customer wants, until it bites us, and then we slowly but surely start learning the same lessons, I suppose. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely would. I mean, there was I stumbled upon it a little while ago. There was a Harvard Business Review. I'm going to get the date wrong, but it was like 1995, if even predating that, or around that time, 1999 or something like that, where they came up with a I probably get the title wrong, everything wrong, but the concept I'm hopefully going to get right for you. But they came up with a small business maturity model, and it spoke about the crisis of autonomy, the crisis of control, the crisis of bureaucracy, and then underneath that same trend, they would have what it would address that. So crisis of I can't remember them off the top of my head, but what was interesting to see in that is that you've got these huge organizations, very mature, and they're having this crisis of autonomy, when that's the one thing that we've been striving for. When you look at DevOps and things like that, autonomy is the big thing. We don't want bureaucracy, we don't want centralization, because it's not effective. And it's true. I mean, if you want to be innovative, you need to allow teams to come up with ideas without constraints and so forth, and they need to be able to get access to all the resources they need. So autonomy is absolutely the way to go. But now we've got this thing called the crisis of autonomy, written about for small businesses years ago, which then leads to the crisis of control and then the crisis of bureaucracy. And what's interesting is that seems to be a bit of a cyclical thing. And I think what's happening there is it's that, maybe at an organizational level, we've seemed to ebb in of, if I look at the timelines correctly, ebb into centralized versus decentralized ways of doing things back and forth in business for some time. And by the same business, I'm talking about with IT as well. There's lots that we've centralized and decentralized and re-centralized. And so there seems to be a cycle there where we're saying, and I think I know what it is. It's like, for example, with the DevOps thing, there has been absolute constraint in being able to achieve innovation, achieve flow through centralized bottleneck models. And so we force this message, autonomy, autonomy, autonomy. We enable it through the technologies, we enable it through culture, through everything else. But it is always to the extremities. So now you've got situations where now we've got major autonomy, but we don't have any control over what they're doing. Everyone's just all over the place. Can you help us out with, centralizing it, or and so it's interesting to see these cycles coming back through again, even now today, where we're achieving this great autonomy, but now we absolutely do have an issue where we're not learning collectively as a hive from these individual pockets, because we don't have those feedback mechanisms. The feedback mechanisms are in those pockets, and we don't have these central functions collecting that and standardizing that and running that effectively. And yeah, so I think I think there's now this crisis of control we're in, and we're now having to figure out, well, how do we control it? And ironically, that's going to then lead to the crisis of bureaucracy again. Maybe, I don't know, but interesting observation that I've had, and what I've seen in practice.
Why don't we learn? I mean, if you think about these cycles, I mean, if it keeps on repeating itself and we keep on seeing it, don't you think there's any hope that we can at some stage learn that there's a middle way?
Well, to be honest, Johan, I don't, in reflecting upon what we're going to discuss today, I also thought, I was trying to be pragmatic and think, maybe it's not so bad that we keep doing these same things over and over again. Different contexts as well, because the DevOps context is a completely new context. And this autonomy that we're doing in development is a completely new context, I think. And it's kind of breaking new grounds. And yes, there's going to be massive disaster along the way for some, and that's obviously not what we want, but it has stretched the art of the possible from where we were. And I think that these disruptive approaches and so forth do have merit, and I think the root of it might be, I say this with great caution because I'm not completely convinced, but it's where I'm thinking at the moment. A lot of people enter the workplace. You get these different waves entering the workplace. And when you enter the workplace, as I had many years ago, when you picked me by the scruff of my neck and told me there was a better way, you have no idea. You're learning everything from scratch. And I think we are all learning, and it's a continual journey until the day we die. We're learning. I mean, if I look at very senior people, and Johan, you're not in that category, so that's a nice little compliment for you. But when you look at really senior people who are CI, have been around the mill for many, many years, they don't have the formula for success.
Okay, I've
because they're still
lost you. Are you back?
Are you there? Can you hear me? Hello?
Seem to have lost you there.
Can you not hear me now?
Yeah, the last that I heard that you said I was not in that category.
Oh, yeah. I was saying very senior people. You weren't part of that category, so you were safe.
Okay, so
the what I was saying, because what I was saying just at the end of it was, people who've been around the mill for many, many years and are on the point of retirement and have been very successful, they don't have all the answers. And so what that suggests is that we're all in these cycles of learning, and we're all going to make the same mistakes because it's part of the learning process. And maybe that's why we keep going around and around. I remember principles that you and the industry have taught me many years ago, and the only time the penny really dropped and I really got the concept was when I messed it up completely. Sometimes we need that failure at an individual level, perhaps, to learn from it, to be able to avoid the mistake again. And I think that's maybe why we keep getting caught in the cyclical approach. The new manager who's never been a manager before, he was a developer, is now brought in, and the industry's talking about autonomy. It makes sense, and yes, it does. You throw it in, but you haven't learned about the other aspect of complete autonomy and the damage that might cause. And so you're now learning that process and asking for help to get that right. Excuse me. So maybe that's it. I don't know.
Okay, so let me just maybe put a little bit of context. So we've got a lot of people, especially on the technical side of the divide, who's saying, stuff it, we don't need all of these bureaucratic processes and controls. Tools is our savior, and if we implement the tools correctly, nothing will go wrong. And then there's people who's a little bit older sitting on the other side of the divide and saying, you wish, hold my beer type of thing. You need these a little bit more discipline, a little bit more structure, a little bit more controls. And I'm very cautious when I say control, because I think to a large extent in the last 15 years we've gone berserk in terms of control. Especially if you want to say DevSecOps, then the Sec guy specifically has gone nuts. I mean, we're controlling things that's imagined on Mars. There's actually,
I think maybe, sorry to interject, Johan, but I think I think this is the root of a lot of our problems at the moment, between, coming back to the title of our session, the ITIL and the DevOps divide. I think the challenge is that we've got developers who are leading the way in a lot of thinking on how we, so I mean, what, 2010 or so, around that time, we moved from the model of delivering applications through CD or download and implementation, and that was it, until 3 years later you get the new update, or the year later you get the new update. We moved from that model to here's a running application, live service that needs to be maintained, everything else on the fly. Now, I don't come from that background, so taken with a pinch of salt, my putting myself in the shoes of the development world, coming from where we were, coming from the ops side of things, it's, we were looking at, well, how do we manage things on an ongoing basis, and really trying to look at that sort of big picture. Now the operations guys, the development guys are now having to figure out this ops world, and I think tragically, ITIL has just earned a really bad rep with dev teams, because they were at the end of the spectrum where the change management was saying no, 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 and it frustrated technical people beyond recognition, to the point that they detest and they hate the framework. And I run into these conversations still today. They'll say to me, "Oh, ITIL, yeah, change management's useless." No, the framework gave you a bunch of ideas and a good way of trying to apply them. It's up to the individual to make it work. That is the disclaimer that maybe should have been a little bit more clear on ITIL. There's a lot of good ideas. There's a lot of good intent. There's a lot of good ways to structure things. And yes, those will change and those will develop over time. But if you're going to take them and just consume them as they are in the book, you're going to have issues. You have to use your own mind and apply your mind to the problem that you're trying to solve, and find the best way to solve that. If you have no point of reference, here's a great framework that will help you get started. And I think the issue between this divide is the fact that we use the word ITIL in daily engagement with business, daily engagement with other teams. We'll bring up ITIL. We'll bring up service management. We'll bring up DevOps. What the hell does any of that mean to any of those other people? What does service management mean to a developer who's now been pulled into this thing called DevOps? And when these people from DevOps come into the operational space, for people who have no exposure to those kinds of practices, and they're saying, we're going DevOps, and that means that we have to now integrate. So you're going to attend all these meetings. Suddenly you're speaking a language that the other team just does not understand, and that is all you're conditioned to understand, to speak and talk about. And it's the same when we use the word business to blockade this. You don't understand this realm. Business is business talk. You don't speak that talk. IT is IT talk. You don't speak that talk. And I'd go far as to say, cloud. What the hell is cloud for most people in business? And some practitioners in IT, they don't get what cloud is. And I'd even take it as far as to say, I don't think that there's a large portion of people who don't truly understand what the power of cloud means for their organization. Mm-hmm. So maybe what the problem is that we've gone into these tribes of best practice focused or discipline focused regimes, and we're kind of losing the bigger picture because of that.
Now, isn't it interesting that actually so much of the bad rep of something like ITIL is about a bunch of people running it down around doing Control-C, Control-V. And I mean, I made the same mistake. I mean, the first big service management job that I did is I was the head of service management. And I had a service management team. And I always used to joke and say, the rest of the organization survived in spite of us. Because it was all just a bunch of BS. Yeah. Instead of treating all of these little labels like a good education, and then having an adult conversation cross-functionally about what it is that we're trying to do as an organization. And I think maybe part of that conversation we were able to have because of COVID, because we didn't have a choice. We had to have that conversation.
Sure.
My fear is, though, that as we, and I hope it doesn't happen, we return to normal, which isn't normal. It is so abnormal. That we're going to take all of the good things that we've learned from this experience and we're going to forget it.
I've already sadly seen old practices reverted back to, and I can only, I would have thought that 2 years of conditioning or a year and a half worth of conditioning might have literally, it would have been enough to change, to bring us into a whole different way of practice. And again, it's not my space of expertise, and I might, there might be a good explanation for it at a psychology or an organizational change theory perspective. I don't know, but it is interesting to see how individuals revert back to things a year and a half ago. Maybe it's because it's so solely ingrained. It's been so practiced for so many years, and it's so solely ingrained that that's the default
part of the
operandi.
problem is control. I think part of the problem is the fact that we were able to forget about some of these controls that we had in place, which we should have realized is actually not necessary because we did pretty okay without them. And now, all of a sudden, I don't know. Have you read Michael Gerber's book about bullshit jobs?
No, I listened to the podcast or the event you shared. Yeah.
and I suspect that some of these roles in organizations that now need to justify their existence again, and forcing us to behave badly.
Maybe.
What did Drucker say? What gets measured gets done, isn't it?
Yeah, I saw someone contending that idea because I think that's part of the. Oh, I didn't read it. So that's just like, because I was going to say that's part of the problem as well. Is like, we're all in this global community. If you looked at, LinkedIn's a great product, and it serves its purpose tremendously well. But it also gives people gives everyone access to a platform where people. I just love reading through people's titles, and I'll be careful not to use any of them because I don't want to offend anyone. But I've seen some creative use of titles. And there was one I saw. You know what? I don't even want to go down that road because it'll probably wind up biting me in the backside. But there are some very creative uses of titles, and even people are saying, people are advocating for that. Like, let's focus on what work you really do. And so you've got people coming up with wonderful, wonderful titles that I feel are extremely artificial. It doesn't really. Maybe my thinking is old school. Maybe I'm also not clicking. Maybe I'm not getting it. But it's all feeling very superficial, and I think a lot of the people are looking for ways to brand themselves and to keep themselves relevant. And I see a lot of that in framework discussions and people challenging old, good, strong standing principles. They want to have their angle on it, and they're going to post something about it, and it's a lot of noise. And none of it's based on metric or measure or research or evidence. It's just based on, this is a funny, cool idea. Let's challenge this and this notion. And there's obviously going to be merit in a lot of it, but there's so much noise out there with new practices, new frameworks, new everything coming out. I like to look at it from a sense of, great, there's a whole lot of new tools and means for us to get things done. And anyone who's worth their salt, who's gone through and really trying to understand the tools that they use. I mean, I wouldn't go to a sculptor and expect him to pick up a new tool and just start, sculpting out a statue of David. They've refined the use of that tool over many years. Maybe that's the challenge, is you've got all these tools. How do you, which ones are the ones you focus on to refine so that you can really get good at your craft? Because one thing that'll always be there is your craft. What is your craft? You're a specialist at something, and how do you make sure that is providing value to a customer somewhere?
But here's an interesting thing about craft. I mean, that sort of brings me back to this idea of Clay Christensen's idea of jobs to be done, and that he contended that that jobs are stable over time. So what is it that you really do? And I quite like the idea of craft in terms of that.
Yeah.
Because quite often we describe what we do in terms of the technology rather in terms of the value that we create.
Well, here's something controversial. To that exact point. Here's some tips on where you might be getting DevOps wrong. You've got a DevOps team. If you've got a DevOps team,
you've got an ITIL team.
You got an ITIL team, you might be missing the message of what it's supposed to be. If you've got a DevOps manager or an ITIL manager, you might be missing the message.
First job.
Hold on a second. So maybe, yes, absolutely, maybe. I have to stick with my analogy here. So yes, and I'll.
I'm just comparing it to my first job.
Yeah, sure. So
how I got it wrong. Yeah.
I'm gonna apply some tension here, and then I'll apply some release and explain why afterwards. So, if you got those teams, you got those managers, you might be missing the message behind what we're trying to achieve. My other favorite is that we were doing we were doing DevOps, and then Steve left, and we weren't doing it anymore. And it probably means you weren't doing DevOps to begin with. And you know what, Johan, I'm seeing this every day. So it's not me, just funny stories. I'm seeing people doing this. And the reason why I'm saying DevOps teams and DevOps managers and why we might be going wrong here is, what is DevOps? Fundamentally, what are we trying to do with DevOps? We're trying to be faster.
No, here's the thing that we're trying to do with DevOps. We're trying to break down the communication barrier between two teams that were opposing each other with opposing views and actually getting them to work together. That's what we're trying to do.
I'll challenge that. I think that's part of it. I think DevOps is about creating flow. The intent, when you look at the Phoenix project and this wonderful controlled narrative of what good would look like, it's about creating flow and the ability to enable flow with security and reliability and all those good things as part of it. And then part of that is getting those two worlds to speak together. But is that the whole picture? Because if you create flow there, then how about getting flow from finance and flow from strategy and flow from all the other organizational elements? Because that, for me, is, if you're going to take the hat from manufacturing and what Toyota succeeded in and all those things, then that's the bill you're putting yourself up against. That's what, and I believe the author's intent was that is what DevOps is supposed to represent. When you look at the intent behind what they're writing about, that's what they're writing about. So if you've got a DevOps team, the point I'm making there is that you've got a team focused on flow. It can't work. It's a constraint because everything else is a constraint around it. Everyone needs to be part of the flow. Maybe DevOps isn't the best word to be using, because by using DevOps, you're isolating your efforts into one space. When everyone in the organization needs to be aligned, marketing needs to be aligned and part of the flow. Everyone needs to be part of the flow. That's what flow is about. Theory of constraints. You're limited to the area of constraint, your one bottleneck, and business is going to be a big bottleneck for the DevOps team. All those kinds of things. So, and when it comes to ITIL, same problem. When we're talking about service management, so again, ITIL's great. DevOps is amazing. They're complementary. I've never seen how they're now starting. You're seeing papers coming out and discussions coming out where they just released something and we've got that, and I'll be honest, I got a bit annoyed by seeing that, because I'm like, why are we reinventing the wheel when the the stuff is there, and yeah, maybe we just need to grow on about it. Don't bash it, just grow on it, develop it further, right? But with service management, I feel like I was at fault, missed the plot completely. So here we are in service management. Let's go and make sure you've got all the processes in place. Tick, 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 tick. There's your bureaucracy engine laid out right there. My favorite discussion when it comes to how do we take it forward, and how do we learn from our mistakes. When you look at the organization, when you look at what really matters at the end of the day, is when I go into a restaurant and I pick up the menu and I see this lovely juicy steak, is my thought as a customer going to be, I'll only eat that steak if they cooked that on a Russell and Hobbs fryer. They used the correct type of vinaigrette method and approach, and they used a Falcon dual fuel cooker with the complementary ovens and all that. I couldn't care what's going on in the kitchen. I really couldn't. Now the problem is service management's actually in the kitchen. Why isn't service management across the business? Because I'm getting the service. The service doesn't happen in IT. The service is across the board. It is actually completely divorced from the business and IT and whatever other structure you want to wrap around it, and DevOps and everything. It's divorced from that. At the end of the day, you're keeping yourself a revenue stream, or as a nonprofit, you're keeping your value being provided by providing a service that provides certain features or addresses certain needs or jobs that need to be done by a customer, and that's the reason why they want to use you. So I come back to saying to service management professionals and saying, so who designs services in business? Probably be our marketing team. They put together these new offerings, and then our product teams and logistics guys. They help with in the manufacturing. They're the ones who create the new services. And have you met with them? No. That is what IT and business divide means. Why are you both creating services?
Even worse. I mean, and I've seen it over. And I'm working with some FMCG guys. The things that comes from the marketing teams dreaming and scheming up new products and services without an understanding of that fundamental customer job that needs to be done.
Is that problem as well, Johan?
Scary.
So,
but I just quickly want to add something before we go on. Remember what I said to you, it's about people communicating, and then you said, no, it's about making things faster. I just need to remind you, the way that you make things faster is by making it slower, because that's how flow always begins, number one. And number two is, if everybody communicates, then most probably we'll have a better chance across the organization. So it's this thing of specialization and silos and us and them.
And the sad thing is DevOps has been geared to address that. But I think people have gotten so caught up in practitioners, and I'm not saying they've contributors to DevOps. There's good content coming from that side of the camp, and that's the other problem for me, industry-wise, that it's that side of the camp. We're all part of the same thing. We're all part of the service value creation engine. We should be completely integral. And it's sad that we're not. And it really saddens me that we're not, because, man, the stuff we could come up with and work on together would be phenomenal, except there's these camps that are now sort of forming out. And, I get the frustration that DevOps developers would have had with ITIL, but they also don't understand the starting point that many organizations have to take on a much bigger picture, perhaps. And I've seen ITIL go completely wrong in terms of bureaucracy and stuff. We all have, right? I mean, and that isn't what ITIL is prescribing. It's not prescribing bureaucracy. That's not what it's doing. I see them as both very complementary approaches and tools to getting a job done. And maybe that's the answer, is that we have to challenge ourselves to stop using terms like DevOps and start to engage our minds a bit and think, what am I actually trying to say here? What is the benefit or the outcome I'm actually trying to drive for here? And I know we have to label teams, and I'm not saying don't use labels. We have to call DevOps for the sake of knowing what we're talking about. We have to call ITIL for the sake of what we know what we're talking about. Same for total quality management, same for lean, same for anything. It needs a label. But when it comes to conversations with various stakeholders, I mean, it should be about what it is we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve flow. What is your vision for DevOps? What's the definition of DevOps for you? There isn't an industry definition for DevOps. Problem number one. I think in order to frame something, we need to first define what it is. And my pet peeve, Johan, is, and I know it's true, and I know I upset a lot of people when I say this, but I hope that they can see what I'm trying to say as well. When someone says to you, so what's DevOps? It's culture. What the hell does that even mean for someone who's trying to adopt DevOps? It's not just a culture. It's tool sets. It's methodologies. It's ways of doing things. Yes, it's all about a culture. It's all it's mainly about achieving that culture to enable it. But just dropping off it's a culture. It doesn't help anyone. And that's not a definition for DevOps.
Yeah. By the way, guys, I acknowledge you and I see you. My keyboard is just too far from me to be able to type back to you. Thanks for the hands up and the confirmations and the thank yous. But yeah, Richard, I think that's exactly the thing. Maybe DevOps isn't about culture, but maybe it's time for us collectively as business to actually think about first principles.
Well, part of the problem is we tend to in IT, just very quickly, Johan, and then I promise I'll keep myself quiet for a while.
No,
but
it's your conversation.
Part of the problem we have is I think we also, within IT, seem to talk about business as if they've got their act together. And everything is neatly bowed and works perfectly. And we couldn't be more further from the truth. Business has got the same complex issues as we have got in the IT camp. Finance, again, not picking on finance, but finance is a silver, or is the ivory tower in business that is can be bureaucratically holding up production on many other different things. It's not unanimous to IT, and IT we keep laying on this whole enabling business, but how does business get enabled when the wheels aren't even on the car for business? Business is getting by despite their best efforts, and here we're coming on we're going to transform, and empower business, and it's like business doesn't even have their act together just yet. Business doesn't even have a clear strategy with clear objectives and an understanding of their competitive context. And they're not reviewing that every 6 months or however long they have to do it. They don't have a clear view as to where they're actually adding value to a market. But yet here we come assuming that we're going to throw them with all this cool cloud stuff because we're going to take the market on. No, you're not, because you're doing a really rubbish product and your business is not really up to speed to being able to deliver any of that. And that's part of the problem, right? Is there's that other domain that we assume is great, and it's a mess in many organizations. Obviously not all, but yeah.
Yeah, it's musical chairs. Two quick comments. Last night I listened to a podcast from Dave Cannon, and somebody asked him, so how do we measure customer value for our IT services? And his answer was, you don't. So yeah, good lesson. You don't and you can't. Yeah, it's not possible. You can't measure it on your side of the fence. 3 years ago, I asked Peter a question about what advice would he give, Peter Brooks, what advice would he give a youngster that wants to enter into the IT, into an IT career? And he said, why do you want to engage in a career in something that shouldn't exist?
Well, if that's not controversial, I don't know what is.
Yeah, but there's value in that conversation. I mean,
there is
this BS of all these divides instead of, And I suppose that's one of the reasons why I like smaller organizations, because it's easier for them to be flattered.
The problem is there's more ego to deal with, and that again for me is the problem, as a challenge with smaller organizations that I particularly do not enjoy, is the dealing with the, if you're wanting to make positive change, sometimes the person at the helm is the complete inhibitor of the organization moving forward. Sometimes it's led with a lot of ego, and you can't see success because it comes bottlenecked up against that kind of thing. So
are you telling me in large organizations there's no ego?
oh no, I'm definitely not implying that's not the case. I think the problem is that it's easier to get access to that level in smaller organizations, and in bigger organizations, there's a few people pointing at each other saying, "Hey, don't drop the ball," whereas you've just got this one person in a smaller organization, typically, that calls the shots. There's no way around that.
The reasons in large organizations is also that, the moment anything seems a little bit controversial or risky, it's easy to push you from pillar to post.
Absolutely.
And eventually nothing just happens. That's the place that good ideas goes to die in many organizations, which is very, very sad.
Well, then I think we can both agree both are difficult to navigate then.
Yeah. Sorry for scratching my eyes. Everybody thinks that spring is awesome. I don't. I hate spring with a passion.
At least now I know some of my comments. It wasn't me who made you cry.
Yeah. So I mean, it sort of brings us to some really interesting ideas about organizations. Things like holacracy, which I think is very extreme, but what an exciting way of thinking to explore, whether it's feasible and workable. I have my doubts, but it's an interesting conversation.
What is that? Sorry, I didn't pick that up.
The ITIL organization idea.
I actually haven't investigated that fully yet. I need to dig into that still.
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose if there's no ego and everybody can be adult about stuff.
There's your failure point on your idea right there.
We can't build an ideal organization where all of the shit will just work.
Yeah, that is a factor that needs to be kept in mind, as I think that is a very important dynamic. And we look at there's some great methods and ways to manage that from an organizational change perspective, understanding how to build coalitions to work around people like that and so forth. We talk about bullshit jobs. Ironically, it is a bullshit job, but it's a bullshit job that it has to be done, not that the job itself is a bullshit job, if that makes sense. The amount of effort and time that needs to be spent on getting people, getting around the bureaucracy, getting around the politics, instead of actually delivering value and actually engaging and getting things done, that for me is a bullshit job. It shouldn't be there. And it's unfortunate because that is the human condition, and that is something I don't think is going to be going away.
Yeah, and here's the scary thing. I mean, with the promise of changes in technology in the 70s, there were people who were postulated that our productivity level by the year 2000 would be up by 30%. And it wasn't. We just found new hurdles to introduce to keep people busy and occupied and not productive.
Maybe it's because, Johan, maybe it's because people do not get to see the impact that they're having on customers, the direct work that they're having. I mean, that's a well-known thing. If you show someone the direct impact that they're having on value contribution to a customer, their focus will likely be far more on those needs and addressing those things than faffing about on a whole bunch of other things to try and, I don't know, prove their worth, or, real problems they think exist that, again, when you put in the context of who actually matters, the customer, you find really doesn't add much value. Maybe it's how do we cascade our metrics and our objectives and things down to a level. I mean, that is a total, that is a well, it's total quality management principle, but it's a Toyota. That's a principle from Lean.
Catchbull, yeah, what is Catchbull's name now again? Ocean Connery.
Can't even remember that name out of the long list of names.
Ocean is the idea that your
Oh, sorry. Yes, I'm thinking of the name of the person. No, I'm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a good principle. Really, I think implementing that in an enterprise that's why it's nearly impossible, because of the myriads and the layers of complexity, and that's where the organizational structure is working against you. But in principle, that is probably why we have so many bullshit jobs. Maybe that's why we've got people who are just not focusing on the right things, because we're not able to show them how they made an actual impact on a customer's life. Maybe.
And Richard, what's actually quite interesting is that if we say that a proper goals cascade can help people to understand their contribution to customer outcomes, not business outcomes, because Drucker said the purpose of a business is to create a customer. What's the act from the Chicago School of Economics said that the purpose of a business is to make profit, which is wrong. I mean, that's a bad idea to do that. But if everybody can see what their contribution is to value for customer, that would be great. But there's one proviso. That means that the role of leadership needs to change.
Absolutely. Incentives need to change.
From supervisory to coaching. I mean, this whole idea of Gemba walks and whatever. What's the purpose? And Lean is so incredibly smart. In terms of behavior, and reinforcing good behavior. Is the purpose of a Gemba walk is to go and see how you can help your people. How you can you can empower them, how you can enable them, instead of running around. And I think that's where things went wrong. When Tom Peters started talking about managing by walking around, lots of people started doing it, but all that they were doing is they were just
micromanaging.
They were micromanaging and criticizing people and actually making their work misery. And
I don't think
it's short to live a miserable life.
I think that the challenge with the Gemba walk in the dare say a modern context is that managers are so overloaded with meetings and demands that they practically don't have time to go and walk through.
There's a very simple solution for that. And I mean, and the role of a lean leader is as follows. You spend a quarter of your time with people higher up. You spend a quarter of your time with your team, and you spend half of your time doing your own work. So, I mean, managers not having time because they're sitting in meetings, that's their own fault. You just say no. I mean, we've created this monster where people get paid a ton of money for doing bugger all.
Oh, don't call me out like that on live TV, Jan. Jeez.
But it is, there's nothing. There's and it's sad. It's sad to see how intelligent, capable, talented people's ability gets wasted by being a tick on the box saying, do we have a representative of the X team?
Mm.
Instead of us having real conversations in real time about real issues, which we, to a large extent, were actually forced to do when all of a sudden there was a little gap between where Teams and Zoom meetings started taking that role again, and people just spent the whole bloody day, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
in Teams and Zoom meetings. Yeah,
You know,
and
David,
I just
Dave
can't help. I'm at heart, I am this anarchist that just do not like
wants to see the
structure.
world burn.
Uh,
Well, you know, David J. Anderson, I did a podcast with him some time ago, and he said something that was really cool. So he led the Kanban, the software Kanban movement, and I, you know, out of lots of people to follow, I really enjoy following him because it's very factual, it's evidential based, and there's many stuff that out there that is just. He mentioned that you know you sit in a coffee shop, you'll see a manager in the coffee shop, you know, frantically working on emails and managing and so forth. And I'll probably get this whole story back to front as well with my how I remembered it. But he was saying that the person in the coffee shop managing the coffee, you can see everything that's going around and whatever, is more likely going to be a better manager than that manager with their MBA and all the methodologies and the best practices, because they're there, they're hands on, they're seeing what's going on, they're able to manage and respond to things as and when they happen, and they know the dynamic of everything that's going on, and that other manager is not. They don't have a full visual view of everything that's going on in their space. And if David ever does listen to this, I do hope I got the analogy right. But you know that's what's so interesting is it's like you don't need to be an MBA or a Harvard pedigree manager to be a darn good manager. It's just about being engaged and getting your hands in there and understanding and so forth, and you know, not being caught up in this whirlwind of meetings that we tend to find ourselves in. But yes, will that ever change? I don't know.
Richard, isn't that just being a good human being? You know, being engaged with other people. You know,
But I have to be
helping where
cautious.
you can.
It does, yeah. But I also don't want to imply that
Doing what
people are
needs to be done.
absolutely. But I mean, that implies that the people who are managers out there doing that are not good human beings. And I don't think
Yeah, no,
their
no, no,
intent.
no, no, no,
I know,
that's
I know
not
that's
what I'm
not your
saying.
intent. I know that's not your
No,
intent.
that's not what I'm
But
saying.
but I'm getting to the potential root of the problem is they don't go there with the intent of. Well, some of them are a bit narcissistic, and maybe they do, but they're going there to try and get their team to perform. I think coming back right again to our core discussion is that you get drowned in a myriad of information from all directions, best practices. Like you kind of have to choose one master, and not so, and by that I'm not saying you focus on ITIL, you focus on DevOps. Your customer is your master, and if you don't understand how your organization's delivering value to a customer and the intricacies of that, then you know I think it's time for us to take a step back and say we need to that's what we need to start focusing on. Like the frameworks, all vitally important. ITIL is vitally important to setting a foundation, and going beyond a foundation. I mean, I'm not in any way implying ITIL is foundational. I mean, you know, helps getting your strategy, modernizing your strategy, all these great things. ITIL's a great framework, and it is a great framework. I will argue that with anyone who comes to me and says it's bureaucratic. No, you don't know how to apply ITIL if that's the case. And I truly believe that because I've seen ITIL working perfectly well. So how do you explain that? You know, the other element is, and the other thing, DevOps, remarkably brilliant approach to taking, you know, the manufacturing concepts, applying them to software engineering and organizations. And yes, this integration needs to happen, you know, with ops and dev, but I wouldn't make it an ops and a dev thing either. It's like everyone needs to be focusing on the service. So all these tools are at everyone's disposal. If I'm a practitioner, if I were to give advice to a practitioner entering the market today, DevOps, service management, whoever you are, and Johan, I might be wrong, I have chosen to try and transcend above those discussions and not get involved in those discussions anymore because they're fruitless.
Pointless.
And I'm just constantly reminding myself, like, oh, wait a minute, there's a customer out there who's receiving a service. What's their experience? What's going to stop them from going to someone else to get the same service? And in a digital economy, when you've got two providers that you can load both apps on your mobile phone, and you might not like the way they've updated the logo on theirs, and I'm such a finicky individual, I won't use them anymore because of such a silly thing like that. With customer relationships as fickle as that in a digital realm, can you afford to not be focusing with all your might and with all your heart on keeping that customer? Because once they're gone, it is the switch cost in the digital economy is almost next to nothing, based on effort, based on everything else. It's just start using someone else. Getting them back, I think, is even harder because they're now using them, and they're using a competitor.
Yeah, it's now not a technical switch. It's now an emotional switch, and emotional switches are very, very, very difficult.
Absolutely, and very, very callous and very petty and very silly, and completely justifiable. And the point being is that the longer we sit and dispute which best practice is the best, and believe me, I know the discussion exists. I want to get from point A to point B. What's the best way to get there? I don't believe any framework is going to give you the full answer to that. You need to transcend above that and start thinking more in terms of what are we trying to achieve, and start researching and investigating and applying your mind and start applying critical thinking into finding out, right, what is the best way to do this? Get consultants in to help you. Hold them, but be objective. Don't get them to come do the work for you.
Yes.
Get them there.
And I think that's one of the things. Stop implementing frameworks. They are intended as education.
Mm-hmm.
They are not intended as work. And I mean, when we write best practice, that's what we do. We try and describe as broadly as possible. We're not prescribing anything. So the dumbest thing that you can do is to implement a framework, or have to have an XYZ manager and team, doing stuff despite of the rest of the organization, or the rest of the organization doing their work despite this team. Yeah.
And I think we need to also understand that this is exceptionally difficult. It's not easy to transcend above it. And great, that's simple, Richard. Thanks for that advice. You have sorted my career out for the rest of my life. No, it is the biggest challenge you could ever take in your career, because you have to fill your head with as much theory as you can and much understanding and as much practice as you can. And you might not get it right, but I think you'd get a lot closer to going the right path because you're not getting tangled in the weeds of irrelevant stuff. You're focusing on a direction that I think might get you somewhere, get you closer to what your customers need at the end of the day.
Yeah,
I might be wrong. It's my trajectory of where I'm going. I think it's the right way, but
I completely agree. I think what we need to also agree on is that the next conversation will be about the job of transcendence. So I just need to wish my wonderful wife happy birthday today. And I've promised her that I would finish this call in exactly 1 minute. Richard de Kok, as always, a pleasure. So nice to have you on the podcast. Thanks, mate. I appreciate your friendship, your input.
Likewise. Thanks for having me on.
A lot.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Johan. And big love from here as well.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone.